warmly welcome you back to this our show, Think Tech-wise Humane Architecture. This happening to be our 291st show. And you are, thanks to you, Ash, bringing this up down there, our accumulated viewer number, which you can see down there. We are in the 16th episode to find out what we have in common recently through architectural projects and their authorship with the other windy city of Chicago in Illinois. And we're going to continue to talk about that next. And we is usually DeSoto Brown Bishop Museum historian and archivist, sometimes from his Bishop Museum, but often from his easy breezy home at the foothills of Diamond Head. But technology failed on him today. His computer is down, so it's just me, Martin Despang, nearby from the Waikiki Grand Hotel and its bathroom with a fan on so that I can survive here. We just got our weekly bulletin, which talks about professionalism as far as we wear. And we want to say we are professionally dressed according to the mission of the show and having our built environment in balance with our natural environment, which should use natural systems versus artificial ones. So this slide here is talking about, I wanted to surprise DeSoto, and I'm surprising you now, and he will then watch it, because I wanted to ask him if he, as a child, was one of these impulsive kids who at the grocery store wanted his mom to buy him things which they had strategically placed at the checkout counter cashier. And I did this when I went to Foodland here in our hood, gonna get poke for lunch, and I saw this here and I bought it for us. And so for DeSoto, I gotta show it more from a distance so you can see the whole thing. So this is about Matchbox. This is about cars. We have a show that we have to reactivate, which is comparing automobiles and architecture. So the mobile and the immobilia, because they share a lot. And in fact, they're actually more approachable. We try to make this show as much as little nerdy as possible. We know we are sometimes nerdy, but we want to make it approachable. And we want you, the audience, to relate to architecture as much as you can do to automobiles. And wouldn't you wish you would find in the cashier area bonsai architecture? Maybe when you go to a Lego store, right, in the Ala Moana Mall, you might find Lego architecture, but otherwise you won't find bonsai shrunk down architecture that is as appealing to all ages as here the automobiles are. And so this package here, the top one was DeSoto's weekly German lesson with a very easy one for him, because down here it says the Autobahn collection number 4. And the first car they choose is for him. This is his VW, the Bug. This is from 1962, they say. And since he's a mid-50s kid, that was the car of his childhood. And in fact, later then, when he was a teenager, because he can drive earlier here in America than in Germany, he drove one, and he had a rollover on the way where he goes to work now every day, and he luckily survived us, so he's still with us. So if we have the show quote at the top right, when we get the first slide up, we really want to talk and challenge you, encourage you to think about zeitgeist a lot. So the soul of the time, and DeSoto grew up in the 60s. Well, it was born in the mid 50s. So I also threw in a very small, but actually, if you can zoom on the very top right show quote, I threw in John F. Kennedy's town car. There was a 61, which he drove through our Waikiki in 63, 3 months before he got assassinated in that one back in Dallas. And I think DeSoto really looks like JFK as a young JFK, and it speaks for the time. The times were more formal, and people were more dressed up. The other barometer of zeitgeist is movies or TV series. We had Hawaii Five-0 here, the original one, from 69 to the late 70s, when it was taken over by Magnum PI. And Magnum, again, is more easy breezy and is a lower shirt And architecture shows that. And some architects have very impressively been resisting to the moods of zeitgeist. Our mid and late century modern master, Ron Lindgren, first and foremost, they've always stayed almost stubbornly true to their mission of, high modernism. While some architects have, swinging their flag into the wind of zeitgeist and jumping on any kind of different breeze and basically copycatting the masters, like Steve Au here, for example, at the top with the show quotes, who was, as we pointed out, and we will go back to his Davis Pacific Center. It was built in the early 70s, one of our finest pieces of tropical brutalism. Or just before that, as we show quote at the second from the top right here, his Ward Center from '69, which unfortunately Howard Hughes tore down way too early because it's been some years before they built their soon to come, I guess, high rise out there. And Steve then was going to, and this is the fourth from the top right, was going fully hippie-ish with Ward Warehouse. I asked Bunde to have the chance to show quote at the very bottom left to interview Steve before he left us, at least physically on Earth here. And when I was asking him if Steve would mind being called the hippie architect, which we see there at the very bottom left, he said, no, not at all. In fact, that's how he categorized himself. So these were the 70s. And while, politically, there was this major break from progressiveness to reactionary in the year of 81, where Jimmy Carter passed it on to Ronnie Reagan. But not necessarily did this mean that everyone else in the cultures of crafting, artifacts representing, embodying culture as cars, as movies, as architecture, as clothing, had to agree with that shift to reactionary. And the show quote at the very bottom left, the second one is my father, Günther, who very early in that transitioning, still under Jimmy's reign, at the very bottom, second from left, he basically did our family home as a great piece of following what used to be pretty much. I grew up as a tween, I guess, in my early years on a attic rental unit with a roof terrace, 96 steps up and down, no elevator, walk up as they call it. Was great, was really hippie-ish. And then when I became a teenager, we moved to this house, which then was owned, was less free, I have to say, but still my father, enabled to keep the free spirit of the hippie era, transitioning that into the 80s. The equivalent of these times is here, this project here in Chicago by Harry Weese. Harry Weese, we mostly know as a brutalist, and his prime piece is the subway, the vaulted waffle slab brutalist vault of the subway in Washington, D.C. That's his major body of work. It's truly rooted in brutalist architecture. And then Harry was, just as Steve, able to transition and fully immerse, not as just jumping on the next trend, but really seeing that shift of mindset from the more stiff, McGarrett, Jack Lord, representing suit and tie, very inappropriately, unprofessionally, we have to say, per the criteria of bioclimatically dressed here in Hawaii, to the way more easy breezy Tom Selleck alias Thomas Mechner, right? So fully embracing that transition. And this is what Harry Weese here did fairly late at the end of Ronnie Reagan's, so fully resisting the many years, the two terms of the Reagan era here, and making a very hippie-ish. These are called the river cottages. They're right on the river. So we have creeks that become rivers, and we don't deal with the riverfronts equally nice as basically Chicago. Chicago didn't do that, but there's a riverfront revival project that we have to work into the project now, into the shows here in the future. So stay tuned for that one. And he did this project here, which is also an architect as developer project. The one that comes to our mind here in Honolulu is Alfred Yee and Edward Killingsworth. Their Seaside Hotel, which is now rebranded as the it was the Seaside. Now it's rebranded as the Shoreline. Go figure if that was really worth doing that. But anyways, that was them teaming up. So sometimes architects give it a try and basically become a developer. My dear sister is doing that. They're doing it on a small scale so they don't become big and predatory. They do it on a small, more personal, less greedy driven kind of way. So orientation is key, right, for bioclimatics. So the river, the lake is basically to our left in the bottom right and the top left picture, right? And so accordingly, the whole opening up to the river and with lots of glass is basically facing east. And the one at the top right, the bigger picture is basically then facing south accordingly. So he was doing pretty much okay, keeping it rather, for the summer. This is me having been there about a year ago, almost a year ago. It was getting warm and hotter. So good for the summer overheating protection, of course. Not so good for the winter times that we have like crazy. The wind chill in Chicago can be like very, very chilling and brutal. Keep in mind for coming up, referring to in a couple slides at the very bottom right, the picture again, the big red building, which is a brick building. We will come back to that in a second. But since we're writing the architectural guide for Honolulu, DeSoto and Don Hibbert and Bill Chipman, per the Not Judging a Book by the Cover, let's go inside this riverfront cottages building on the next slide. And we see this at the very top left here, which is, I pulled this from the web. We weren't able to get in there. But you see how funky that is, that building there, and the huge triangular glass. Again, it's facing east, as we already said, but since it's slanted as the roof, it's also picking up some southern sun when the sun turns around. So the overheating protection, it probably needs AC to run. The two other projects don't need that. It's equivalent, talking about Steve Owl. When Steve, at the very bottom left, you see Steve and Irene, when they had us over as Docomomo, and he was telling us the story when he was building Ward Warehouse, he was able to go, just like my dad, from the rented rooftop hippie, he was able to go to owning. So a similarity between the two, and that became his Lanikai treehouse, that he was able to buy a very steep hill, supposedly unbuildable, and he kept the footprint really small and went high. And it's basically a stair without guardrail that generations of his children and grandchildren tumbled down and never broke their neck. And it's very bioclimatic because south is where the hill is, so it's very much close to the south. And you see the big lanai there that is basically facing not just east, but also north, so northeast. So here in the tropics, always keeping it cool. On the right side, you see my childhood's home, again, designed by my dad in the 80s. And this was the bedroom of my parents. We took the picture when they moved out and moved on to Dresden. This is facing south. So passive solar, which is the big thing, and just hot off the press, I was just talking to DeSoto about that because it's so unbelievable, right? We have the big energy crisis going on because with Angela, we're going too much, on Putin's oil and gas. Now that we're off that, we're scratching our hands. What are we going to? And instead of what my dad here did very early as an eco-pioneer in the 80s, basically embracing the south and the sun and being able to heat yourself, keep yourself warm in there with the sun, there's also a glass overhang that he was seasonally protecting with some sails and some membranes in the summer so it wouldn't get too hot in the summertime. But in the wintertime, this early in the year, you can see the sun coming in. But there is also a big white thing in the middle. That's a furnace, right? In Europe, we had predominantly water radiant heat versus the forced air that we adopted from America only for the post-fossil passive house system, but not to AC, air condition, but air distribute, and have the basically exhaust air, extract all the heat from it, run it over a heat exchanger, and re-inject that to the fresh incoming air. But traditionally, we had this here. Now, the government is basically enforcing homeowners to switch out their furnaces from oil and gas to what they embraced as the main alternative, which is the heat pump. Well, the heat pump isn't really a new invention. In fact, the great Alfred Yee that we just talked about with Hans Krock and the ocean thermal energy conversion, the OTEC system is basically like that, but it runs on the temperature difference of the very cold air down there in the ocean and the very warm up there in the upper parts of the ocean, which works best in the equatorial belt, which we are part of, right? So that heat engine basically now, one of the major monopolist companies, a family-owned company, Fissmann, just hot off the press, just sold this to guess who? Well, they sold it to the increasingly troubled tropics of Florida, with a company that originated in there in 1902 by Mr. Willis Carrier. And you might have seen that sign or logo on some of the nasty, not to be anymore air conditioning systems. Mr. Carrier was the inventor of air conditioning. And again, the tropics of Florida were originally innocent, as every tropics. And we had talking brutalism, one of the protagonist of brutalism in America is Paul Rudolph, right? Which he fully basically unfolded that, zeitgeist passion that he had when he was moving up to further the Northeast in Boston. But he started out in Florida, where he's from, and it's some very nice early modernist, easy breezy, tropical modern buildings. But again, then the tropics went kind of the wrong way, and not just climatically, but also politically. And as Mar-a-Lago and Trump and DeSantis, we don't want to go further there. So it's very, very ironic for, again, I think us Germans who shouldn't we have learned what more wake-up calls do we actually need to understand not getting into dependencies with anyone else. And there's no doubt we have a better relationship had and will always have with America rather than with Russia or the Arab world, right? So, but still, reliance on energy is putting stress on relationships, and dependencies in relationship is the beginning of trouble. It's true for personal relationships and it's true for political relationships. So we should now get off reliance on any kind of systems and basically embrace the natural systems, which is way more complicated, again, in the temperate climate where I'm from. But we've been building many buildings to the passive house standard that basically does that. But here in Hawaii, we have it so much easier. So we should basically embrace natural system, which gets us to the next slide. Here, once again, two details from these two projects that have so much alike. To the left is, again, the riverfront cottages by Harry Wees and by my dad, by our dad, Martin Despang. We have our family home there, both really embracing something that every home, every house should have here, which is lanais, right? Opening up to the outdoors, having lanais and balconies, having vertical circulation, as Harry is demonstrating here, which since Tim Yu had allowed this again as a change in the invasive international building code to have vertical egress, so fire escape circulation to be exposed on the outside. My father actually, not just orientation-wise, ran even better than Harry, but also and typologically, because we're always saying to the emerging generation in the Environmental Systems 101, which is the most responsible building you build is actually the one you don't build. Because in these days, where we're not in the indigenous days anymore, where we build with materials, around us from scratch and having no fossil tools, to prepare them, which we don't have anymore. Whatever we do, we pick up a carbon footprint, right? So we're past that. But and that doesn't make, I guess, the industry and the profession and the discipline of architecture so happy, because we rely on commissions and projects, right? So which is the second most responsible building to build in an ecologically responsible is the one that already exists, right? That, was created with a carbon footprint, and we need to get this carbon footprint out of it. And this is what we basically call redux or renovation, or if we change the purpose of the building, adaptive reuse, which is the big thing right now all over the country and in Honolulu, to converting a former office space that since COVID we don't need as much anymore into housing, right? So this house here that my dad converted for us was basically a townhouse with flats. And there was one thing about the 80s, they were rather sort of excessive. And while my dad wasn't doing excessiveness as far as ecologically, but I guess economically, we must have been doing okay, as Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson likes to say when he always goes back into where he grew up. And he basically was able to buy the whole house, and we converted it into a single family residence. That was the only kind of a little bit of an excessivist part of that. But he basically converted that. So you see the white on the right, you see the white lanai slabs is actually the existing. And then similar to Harry Wees there in the new construction, he added a very filigree new skeletal steel construction to it. And our project had these wooden vertical blade louvers that I remember 70s. One of my most hippie-ish memories is that I went with my dad in the car that we have to show you. Next slide, previous slide, Ash, if you can go back one more, because I was showing the car that is for DeSoto here, which is his Beetle up there. But the one for me is the one at the very bottom. And it basically says here, the Mercedes 123 wagon, and they didn't put the dates, and that's why we have the date in that middle there on that slide here, which says 1979 to 86. And if you can zoom into that, the middle picture and the center column there, it also shows us, I guess, so not in the 70s anymore, but in the 80s, with in front of that car. And so that car we were hauling, if we go back to the next slide where we've just been, we hauled all these wooden boards in that station wagon, or a previous one. My dad had the very first one was in the late 70s. We had a blue one. We hauled all this wood to the project on the next slide where we just were. And we were putting in sweat equity and basically installing them ourselves. My dad had these U-profiled, channel steel profiles being done by a blacksmith. And then we were sliding in and just basically, fastening them. We were lazy because there are 3 holes in each of them, and we only used the middle one. And that was lasting forever. I think, we stayed there for 3 decades or so. 80s, even more, even longer, 3.5 decades. And when my dad sold it, I frequently go by for post-occupancy evaluation, evidence-based design, life cycle assessment of our projects in the summers. And the new owner just kept everything. So that's basically the epitome of sustainability, right? Keep things in the life cycle. And we go to the next slide, which has to be our last one for this time here, because adaptive reuse, you remember from the first slide, and if Ash, if you can please go back to there one more time to refresh the recent memory, at the bottom right slide of picture of that first slide, you see the red building. And the red building, now we go inside, and it gets us back to the fourth slide that we just were. Because the inside of that building is this one here. And isn't that really nice? It looks like, and price-wise, we're talking about affordability as a big aspect of sustainability, because if you want to sustain the local people here on the island, you got to allow them to make a living, which we're increasingly struggling with. So this was from, at the bottom right, from a realtor's website. This is basically here from 2017. It's a fairly big 3-bedroom for 775,000, which is not cheap, but probably not that far off what we have here. But there's something that this building here has, right, that we don't have in recent projects like that, because it reminds us of the top basically row there, which is the building that, thanks to the newsletter of Stanley Chang that we get every week right before the show, he sheds a light on that project, on that postmodern project that they turned into condos recently. But versus at the very top right, the show quote, which shares a proposal by the emerging generation, how to rejuvenate that building by basically knocking out the glass and creating lanais all the way around. The current developer did not at all do that, but basically keep it hermeticized. And not just keep it hermeticized, but then also there's a big discussion going on, rightly so, which Stanley is referring to at the top left there, that they're twisting current building code by basically getting by without a window for a bedroom. And that is very, very questionable, right? Because one of the human rights almost, right, is access to fresh air and the view. And if you keep, beings as human beings and other creatures away from that, that might, there was a term in the 70s, right, sick building syndrome. And there was basically doctors, physicians in the medical realm basically finding proof of evidence that depriving human beings from the natural elements is making them sick. And while totally understood, we're so desperate, in need of, 50, 60, 70, whatever units, right, of basically dwellings in the Western mindset, right? So we try to provide for that need, but maybe that's the wrong way that we're providing for that one. And we're picking up from here next week and discuss this further, hopefully with Talking Technology, DeSoto then back with us. And until then, please stay affordably biochromatic, biochromatically affordable, and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for watching Think Tech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.